The other day, I was scrolling through TikTok and I saw that Mr. Miracle was trending. So I thought to myself, why is he trending? I have never heard anyone talking about him. So I checked out why he was trending and I saw this panel. And oh my god, the panel looks amazing. But I was confused. I had only seen Mr. Miracle in the TV show Batman Brave and the Bold. And even then, I didn't know much about him. Until now. I decided to read Tom King's interpretation of Mr. Miracle, and I was amazed by it. At the beginning of the story, we get a short explanation of Mr. Miracle's origin. Basically, at the beginning of time, there were gods and these gods died by fire. And from their ashes, two planets were formed. One was named New Genesis and the other one was named Apocalypse. New Genesis was ruled by the High Father, and Apocalypse was ruled by Darkseid. These two planets were at war with each other. Billions of people died. Since the war was reaching new heights, both planets had to come to an agreement to cease fire. However, to guarantee the truce, both rulers had to exchange their children. Darkseid's child was named Orion and was raised in paradise, and the High Father's child, aka Mr. Miracle, was raised in hell. Mr. Miracle was tortured every day and trained to be a great warrior. In this same place, he met his future wife, Big Barda, sharing the same hatred for the woman who raised them, Granny Goodness, where eventually they both escaped and Mr. Miracle was given the name of Scott Free by Granny Goodness. You get it? Because he's an escape artist. With that name, you can tell he was created by Jack Kirby. After the escape, he arrived on Earth, where he befriended a famous escape artist named Mr. Miracle and his partner, Oberon. When one day a random person murdered Mr. Miracle and Scott Free donned his costume to keep his memory alive. And this is when Mr. Miracle came to be. Before I interpret Tom King's version of Mr. Miracle, I have to give a quick disclaimer. Surprisingly, Mr. Miracle's comics is very dark, and if you suffer from mental health issues, it is a tough comic to read. Now that I said this, let's get back to the comic. The comic starts with Scott waking up in the hospital where we see something wrong happened. The atmosphere feels moody and sad. Even a strong person like Big Barda is crying. In the hospital, Scott gets both wrists bandaged and discharged. When Scott arrives home, he's just sitting, where we can see something traumatic happen. Big Barda and Scott are cheering a moment when they get interrupted by Orion. Orion gives him the order to stand, and Scott does. Orion then punches him in the face and tells him to stand up. He does this a couple of times. After the third or fourth time, Big Barda gets tired of seeing this and intervenes, asking Orion why the hell he's doing this. Orion says that he's teaching Scott a lesson and claiming that he's the son of Darkseid. That is when Big Barda scoffs at him, undermining him, and says, "You are the son of High Father, and he doesn't know how to teach. Only Granny Goodness who knows how to teach." That is when Orion stares at both of them and decides to leave. This is the first time we see some of the mental struggles that Mr. Miracle goes through, asking Big Barda if her eye colors has always been brown, where she responds that they have always been brown. After this series of events, we get the answer to what happened to Mr. Miracle and why he woke up in the hospital. He's in a late night show doing an escape performance. After he's done with the performance, he gets interviewed. The host of the late night show leads him to what happened, saying, "A month back, it was reported that you, I don't know the right words, that you tried something new," insinuating that he committed suicide. After this is said, we see Mr. Miracle head slip a little. He starts laughing uncontrollably and answers with, "I've been doing a lot of escapes lately, a bunch of them, and I was trying to do harder ones, like the hardest one, and everything was getting really easy, boring for me and the audience." Then he proceeds to say, "How can I be better? What doesn't anyone escape from? Death. No one escapes death." Next, we see Oberon making some cuffs that are supposed to be impossible to escape from, but Mr. Miracle escapes from them easily. That is when Big Barda comes in the room, exclaiming that she doesn't like when Scott is by himself because of what happened. But Scott responds with, "I'm not alone, I'm with Oberon." That is when we find out that Oberon has been dead for a while, further seeing how severe Scott's mental issues are. It doesn't really help that Apocalypse and New Genesis are still at war, where Scott has to attend because he's one of the generals of New Genesis. And this is where most of the conflict is seen. He gets in this monotone state of following orders and getting himself to battle. One night, after a long day of battle, Big Barda and Scott get themselves to bed. This is when Scott sees a prophecy. Metron visits Scott at night and tells him that no matter what, he cannot see the face of God. Later that day, he is given the order to kill Granny Goodness, and of course, he complies. When Scott and Bartha meet with Granny Goodness, Granny thinks that they are meeting for a truce. So she exclaims that Darkseid doesn't want a truce, and he wants to win the war. So they end up having a conversation where Granny asks Scott if Metron visited him, and Scott, confused, says yes. That's when Granny explains the prophecy to Scott, saying that only the son of Darkseid can kill him. This is when Scott gets confused once more because he was raised by Darkseid, but he is not his son. That is Orion. But before Scott could ask any questions, Big Bartha kills Granny Goodness, ending her cycle of trauma. The story gets even more interesting because Bartha and Scott know Granny Goodness and they know that they can't trust her, but they can trust Metron. So now a conflict of following the prophecy begins, not even including the mental issues that Scott himself is dealing with. Before the events of the war, we find out that Highfather passed away, and his rule was passed on to Orion. And Orion, with the power of being the new ruler, makes a lot of questionable decisions. So now Scott doesn't know who to trust. Orion gets to a point where he starts killing his own people. That is when Scott goes to confront Orion to stop his madness. And that is when he sees the prophecy with his own eyes, with Orion exclaiming that he is the face of the new god. So because he technically defied the Highfather's orders, Scott was sentenced to a trial for treason where he was found guilty. But Mr. Miracle was checked out of everything. So instead of going to trial, he infiltrated New Genesis to once again confront Orion and speak to him to get back to his senses. And while Scott and Bartha are infiltrating, Bartha is giving hints to Scott that she is pregnant, but Scott doesn't catch any of them. And honestly, this is one of the cutest moments of the series. Just look at them. They look so happy with each other. That all comes to an end when Scott arrives at the throne, where he is about to speak to Orion but instead finds him dead. Dead by the hand of Darkseid, finally realizing that he is the prophecy, that he's the one who is supposed to kill Darkseid. But before going after the prophecy, Mr. Miracle has a child to raise, and we see kind of a twisted way of balancing work life and family, where we see multiple panels of Mr. Miracle on the battlefield, listening to voice memos from Bartha, further expanding the relationship they have. At some point in the story, the war comes to an end, where too much blood has been spilled. This is when Kalibak, who is Darkseid's right hand, must sit down with Mr. Miracle to discuss a truce. It takes them 7 days to come to an agreement. On that last day, Kalibak communicates that Darkseid has a proposition. The proposition is that Darkseid will withdraw all his forces, return all the prisoners, disarm and allow New Genesis forces to inspect Apocalypse, and finally surrender the anti-life equation, which is the most powerful weapon in the universe. All of this sounds great, but there is a caveat. In return, Scott and Bartha have to give full custody of their child to Darkseid, and the boy is to be raised on the Apocalypse. In the next issue, we see how real Scott's and Bartha's relationship is, where they try to avoid the conversation about the baby. Scott chooses the easy choice of giving the baby away, and Bartha wants to make the hard choice to keep the baby, and Bartha calls out Scott for being selfish. This whole time, Scott is complaining about how hard his life has been and how hard being a new Highfather is, but doesn't even consider how hard it has been for Bartha too. Bartha is there for him, holding him and supporting him through all the hard times, and I love how the comics does this, adding a little bit of realism to this fictional world. Anyways, at the end of the issue, Bartha and Scott agreed to use the baby as bait, making it seem like they are going to give the baby away, to then pull the rug and kill Darkseid. They travel to Apocalypse to deliver the baby. They make it seem like they are giving up the baby, and when they do, Darkseid follows through with the truce, removing all the forces and giving up the anti-life equation. Technically, the anti-life equation is just a knowledge, but the equation needs a key, and the key is the Omega Beam. So Darkseid removes one of his eyes, ensuring that he won't use the equation. When he does this, Scott asks if he can say his last word to his child, and when he does, he just snatches the kid. That is when Bartha takes out a miracle machine to kill Darkseid, expressing that no one can escape the machine, but the machine doesn't seem to do any damage. Soon after, Darkseid incapacitates Bartha to get to Scott. Darkseid just beat down Scott. In an instant, we can see the foreshadowing from the beginning, when Orion was punching Scott and telling him to stand up. We see that now at this moment, when Bartha tells Scott to stand up. That is when Mr. Miracle pulls out a firehand knife that was made from Orion's flesh, following through with the prophecy that said that Darkseid was going to be defeated by his own son. His own son is the knife. In the last couple of panels of the comic, we get a little bit of an insight into Mr. Miracle's mental struggles one last time. We can see him having a conversation with Granite Goodness, Forager, Orion, the Highfather, and finally Oberon. With these visions, we see the different depictions of what life means to Mr. Miracle. Granite Goodness wants Scott to hold on to the pain and trauma, to never move forward. On the other hand, we have Forager, who wants Scott to escape hell because life is miserable and encourages Scott to move forward. Then we have Orion, who tells him that life is not only about the good, life is also about the bad. And if life was just easy, you might as well be dead. We also see the Highfather trying to talk to Mr. Miracle, and Scott straight up just punches him, having this symbolism of confronting his trauma and pulling away from it. Finally, we see Oberon one last time. Oberon tells Scott that he needs to hold on to his family. That family is the one thing that will pull him out of his bad times. Family is always going to be there, to never escape them. When I was done reading this comic, I knew I'd read something special. Tom King's version of Mr. Miracle felt like a refreshing take on a superhero story. Not only was the story sad, but it was also funny, happy, and action-packed. And it really felt like the story was real because it touches on the things people go through on a daily basis. I highly encourage people to read about the character of Mr. Miracle, and I can honestly say that I am a Mr. Miracle fan now. Thank you for watching my video. If you like this type of content, please consider leaving a like, subscribe. And if you have a story that you might want me to make a video about, please leave it in the comments down below. And that's it for me. I'll catch you on the next one.